Good morning, everybody. My name is Dave Karnofel with Benchmark International. I'd like to welcome you this morning to our program titled Market Timing. Many business owners feel that the performance of their business, revenues, profits, etc., are the key drivers behind the value of their company. Although you certainly can't ignore these main characteristics of any business, what many fail to consider is the impact that the market can have on the value of their business. And that's the title of our discussion today, Market Timing. Now, before I get started, let me cover just a couple quick housekeeping issues for you. In the upper right-hand corner, you'll notice that there's a room or a space for questions. Please feel free to jot your questions down there. Now, I won't take time during the program to answer those questions, but when we're done, I'll take a few minutes and try to answer as many of those questions as we possibly can. You'll also notice that there are several documents that can be downloaded from that upper right-hand corner. Several documents that will be interesting. One in particular is titled About Us, and that's exactly what it is, everything that you might want to know about Benchmark. So feel free to download those documents at your convenience. Now, some of you may be familiar with Benchmark, some of you may not. We represent the owners of privately held businesses who are seeking some form of exit strategy, partial sale, and equity infusion to obtain capital for growth. We've been doing this for over 20 years. We have offices across the United States, as well as in Europe, from Northern Ireland to South Africa. Me personally, I've been in this business for over 20 years as well. I'm a CPA by training. I started in this industry back in 1999 with a division of Citigroup. Although I'm a CPA, I've spent most of my career in sales, operations, management. I've been a CEO of a large retail chain. I've also been a CFO for an international franchise organization. But I've also owned and operated 6 of my own businesses. And when I share this with other entrepreneurs and clients of mine, I tell them, I empathize with the business owner. I've been there, I've walked in your shoes. I've had those Thursday night meetings where we're all sitting with our fingers crossed, hoping enough cash comes in to make payroll tomorrow. I've been there. I share your pain, and I also share your passion for entrepreneurship. So what are we going to talk about today? What's on the agenda? First and foremost, the basic economic principle that drives the value of anything. And what we'll cover is the fact that this principle, regardless of whether it's a product, a service, or a business, this basic principle will drive the underlying value. We'll also talk about the different markets, a buyer's market versus a seller's market, and how these changing markets affect the value of the business. Then we'll discuss the timing around those markets. What you'll see is those markets go up, they go down, they go up, they go down, and they follow a particular pattern. And historically, they follow that pattern for years and years. And we'll look back again historically at what those patterns look like. And they follow a particular shape unless there are interrupters, things that might happen in the market economically, legislatively, worldwide, that could impact the normal cycle of these markets. And then, of course, what if I miss the market? What happens if I'm not there right at that peak? Can I still sell my business? And the answer is yes, and then we'll talk about some of those strategies. But let's dive in to first the value perspective. Regardless, once again, of whether you're dealing with a product, a service, the underlying value, what a buyer will pay for that product or service, is based upon a fundamental economic principle that's been around since time. And regardless of whether it's a consumer buying goods and services, whether it's a business buying inventory for sale or supplies for use, or whether it's investors or other companies buying companies, the value of these items will be based upon the pure and simple laws of supply and demand. When the demand for a product or a service begins to rise, all of a sudden supply needs to catch up with that demand. It may be a new hot product, a new service that's being provided in the market. And all of a sudden the demand starts to heat up. Well, it takes time sometimes for the supply to match that demand. And when all of a sudden you are the provider of that product or that service, and there's far more demand for your product or service than there's available supply in the marketplace, you have what's called pricing power. And pricing power means you have the ability to charge, and in some cases, nearly whatever you want. So when demand exceeds supply, prices naturally go up. And then, of course, you've got the contrary position. When all of a sudden the market has adjusted and new entries have come in providing that new product or that new service, all of a sudden now supply begins to increase. And when the market may become saturated, for instance, everyone has the product, the supply is plentiful in the market, then now all of a sudden supply can tend to exceed demand. And when supply exceeds demand, what naturally happens to price? Prices go down. So this basic economic principle applies to products, services, and to businesses. So what happens in the business world, and how does supply and demand affect the value of a business? Because in our industry, the industry of mergers and acquisitions, our supply and demand is buyers and sellers. So let's look at what happens in the marketplace. When the market's in a position where the economy is moving along fairly well, revenue and profits are up, sellers of businesses tend to want to hold on and maybe recoup some losses from previous periods and just take advantage of the strong economy. So what happens is sellers tend to go into hiding. They want to participate in the market and reap the benefits of a positive economy. On the other side, we've got buyers. In the environment, we typically have low interest rates when the economy is strong. There's a lot of capital available. Buyers, i.e. big companies, need to continue to grow in order to compete. Financial buyers, often referred to as private equity groups, have capital intended for one purpose, to spend, to buy businesses. So what we've got is a situation where buyers are now flooding the market. So on our supply and demand curve, we've got buyers that are flooding the market, sellers that are tending to go into hiding. What must buyers do in order to entice sellers to sell? Offer more, and prices naturally go up. Now let's take the opposite position. We're in a seller's market here. Let's move to now a buyer's market. In a buyer's market, what happens is the economy tends to soften. Revenues and profits tend to fall. Sellers say to themselves, I'm not so sure I want to go through another market cycle like this. I'm out of here. So sellers begin to flood the market. Now on the buyer's side, we have a whole different situation because money is now starting to tighten up a bit. The cost of money increases, the literal availability of capital decreases. So buyers tend to leave the M&A world and chase higher returns elsewhere in the marketplace. So we have a decrease in demand, and now we have an increase in supply. What must now sellers do to entice buyers to buy? They have to lower their expectations. Prices naturally fall. This is what we call a buyer's market. Now these cycles over time tend to follow the same type of pattern. They move into a peak as prices begin to heat up. All of a sudden, it reaches a peak. The herd mentality takes effect, and things begin to slow down. The cycles move down into a trough, and then they begin to repeat themselves over and over and over, and have done so for decades, if not centuries, through our history. However, early in our country's history, we experienced frequent episodes of financial crisis, bank failures, economic panic. So in an effort to establish some level of control over these radical economic cycles, in 1913, Congress introduced the Federal Reserve System. Now, the intent of the Federal Reserve was to provide a much more safe, stable, and flexible financial system. And to this day, the Federal Reserve operates under what's known as a dual mandate system. The Fed's chief objective is to maximize employment, yet minimize inflation. In other words, drive the economy to a point where we're able to maximize employment, but yet control it such that when prices start to increase to a large degree, to avoid runaway inflation, we want to soften the economy and bring it back down the other side. So let's take a look at what happens. First of all, in a soft economy, the Federal Reserve attempts to stimulate the market through one of the very few vehicles they have, which is the cost of money or interest rates. So by lowering interest rates, now businesses begin to borrow for expansion, to build inventories, to build buildings for capacity. They hire people. Consumers, naturally, because there's more employment, higher wages, consumers begin to spend more. Buyers continue to build more in an effort to keep up with demand. And we reach a point where demand has now exceeded supply. Prices are starting to increase. Now remember, the Federal Reserve's mandate is to maintain price stability or control inflation. So when the economy starts to heat up, how do the Feds react? The first thing they're going to do, because businesses tend to be over-optimistic, overzealous, and overbuild inventory. Once again, it's that herd mentality. Everybody jumps on the bandwagon. Everybody wants to get into the market. And it reaches a point where supply now exceeds demand. While at the same time, the Federal Reserve, in an effort to control prices and soften the economy a bit, they've started to increase interest rates to slow things down a bit. And sure enough, things tend to slow down. Buyers slow down their building. Buyers tend to lay off people, or businesses tend to lay off people. And sure enough, the markets go down the other side. And this cycle continues. Now, M&A activity tends to mirror economic cycles. They go up, they go down, they go up, and they go down. Again, unless there are those interrupters, which we'll talk about here in just a moment. But first, let's take a closer look at the historical markets. If we look back over history, and let's go back just over a more recent period of time, let's say the last 50 years, there were 5 major economic / M&A cycles. So if we look at the average time of these peak-to-peak cycles, it runs anywhere between 8 to 10 years. Now again, this is from the time in which the market peaks to the time in which it peaks again. Sometimes the markets tend to lull in a trough for a period of time. Sometimes they tend to stay at a peak for a few years. So the peak-to-peak periods are what we're looking for. In other words, if I miss this peak, when am I going to see another peak? So let's take a look at the markets respectively. First of all, back between 1955 and 1975, this was the baby boomer era, right? Coming out of World War II, there were more bursts than any time in recorded history. It was the age of corporate conglomerates. So there was a major boom that lasted for 20 years. Then we had the Reagan era, coming out of some of the oil crisis in the 70s, runaway inflation. Along came Reagan and supply-side economics, lowering of taxes, lower government intervention, and we had another run of 10 years. Enough said between 95 and 2002, that was the dot-com craze. Everybody was going public. All you had to do was put .com behind your name and you could go public. Even if you hadn't made any money, even if you hadn't sold anything, you could go public. Well, that era rather ended, obviously. The first trigger of that was the dot-com bust in 2001, and then the economy continued and growth continued a bit, and it peaked again in 2002. Then we had the real estate boom, the housing boom of 2003 to 2009, and that ended. The initial trigger, again, was a little bit before the peak of the financial crisis in 2008. Then we're in our current bull run. Now, some say that it ended here with the coronavirus. Will there be a rebound, and is that a modest blip? Well, we'll take a look at that here in just a moment. But let's look, first of all, at these peak-to-peak cycle times now throughout history. If we go back to the 1955 to 75 versus the 81 to 91 cycle, that was a 16-year peak-to-peak. The next peak until 2002 took 11 years, then 7 years. And then we've got the question of when this market, did it really end? If we look back at other type of interrupters, if you will, similar to the coronavirus, they're typically shorter lived, they're not long in duration, and oftentimes there's a reasonable rebound as a result of pent-up demand, replenishment of inventories, etc. So let's look at what's going on with this particular cycle of 11 years, or if it ends next year rather, that would make it an 11-year cycle. And if this rebound takes effect through the end of this year, there's a lot of things coming up in 2021. It's already the longest bull run in recorded history. So I don't know when it will end, but let's just surmise that it ends in 2021. That would give us a peak to peak between the 09 peak of the cycle and 2021 of 12 years. So the question becomes, when's the next cycle if this one ends in 2021? Well, if we know that there's an 8 to 10 year peak to peak cycle on average, let's just take the average of 9 years. That would mean the next cycle peak could be, theoretically, 2030. I don't have a crystal ball. If I did, I wouldn't be sitting here. I can't determine exactly when that cycle will peak. A lot of times I'm asked that question, when do you think we'll see the peak of this market? And my answer is real simple. There's only one time when you know the peak. That's in the rearview mirror. When you're looking back saying, there it was, I only wish I could have, should have done it then. So don't try to hit the peak. Hitting that peak is not a good strategy. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Let's take a look, first of all, at some of the underlying drivers in the marketplace. Let's specifically talk about the M&A market for a moment. Buyers on one side of the supply-demand curve have to have the ability to buy. That comes with the availability of cash. And if they need more cash, what is the cost of capital? Because the cost of capital determines the ROI expectation of a buyer. In the valuation modeling for a buyer, they look at two major characteristics for valuing any revenue producing asset. And this is for the baseline value before we talk about the market. So let me explain. Baseline value of any revenue producing asset is based upon two key criteria. Number one, what is the cash flow that will be produced by this asset over a period of time, typically 5 years? Secondly, what is the risk associated with my production of that cash flow? Because risk is commensurate with ROI. Once I can establish risk, I can establish my ROI expectation. If I'm risk averse, I'm going to have a very low threshold for my ROI expectation. If I'm willing to take risk, well, that means I also am looking for a much higher ROI. So I start with the cost of money. That's my baseline ROI expectation. Then I build on that based upon risks in the market, risks within a specific industry, risks associated with your specific company, and risks associated with buying a privately held business. All of these items come into consideration when a buyer is determining their ROI expectation. Now, there's a lot that's coming into play here. I don't want to dive too much into the weeds. This looks like it may be a good subject matter for a future webinar on how businesses are actually valued. Right now, let's assume that we have these components in our consideration for value drivers. Okay? Now, we also have a need to continue to grow. Big businesses, any business as far as that goes, must continue to grow. There's an old cliche in the industry that says the minute you cease to grow is the minute you begin to die as a business. Because we're always looking for that way to take the business to the next level. How do we do that in a business? Ironically, there's only two things that you can do to grow a business. It doesn't matter what business you're in, whether it's a product, whether it's a service. Every business operates initially within this particular quadrant, meaning what you offer are these products and services to these customers right here. So how do I grow this business? There's only two things that I can do. Number one, I go out into the market and I develop new products or new services that I sell to my same customers. Number two, this, by the way, is called product line extension. My second growth perspective is I go get more customers that I sell my same products and services to. This is referred to as market expansion. Now, if I'm a big enough buyer or I have access to enough cash, or if I'm a financial buyer, I can do both of these things simultaneously. That's typically referred to as acquisitions. So how do you view this as an owner when we think about this expansion strategy? Think about the products and services that you sell to your customers today. What other products and services do your customers buy that you don't sell them? Who does sell them those products and services? Those are potential target buyers. Because now you have a scenario where their products and services can potentially be sold to your customers. Your products and services can potentially be sold to their customers. Those cross-selling benefits are what's known as synergies in the market. A synergy is when 2 + 2 = 5 or 7. So think about this when you're thinking about who might be a potential buyer for your business. So now let's go back to this growth strategy. I've got to continue to grow my business, right? Have you ever heard of a strategic planning session? Have you ever sat down with anybody to focus and look at the future of your business and say to yourself or to the partners in the room, let's talk about how we can maintain our revenue. If you're struggling to maintain your revenue, what that really means is you're struggling to stay in business because competitors are stealing market share from you. So businesses are continually trying to grow. It's what business is all about. I've got to grow my customers. I've got to grow my products and services. So how do I do that? Well, one, I can do that organically. I can develop a product line. I can develop new markets. But that's a tough road to hoe, and that takes time, that takes effort, that takes energy. Or I can grow through acquisition. You see, when I grow through acquisitions, I can stimulate growth without doing a lot of heavy lifting. When you consolidate company assets, what you're able to do is not only stimulate growth, but gain competitive advantages, increase market share, influence supply chains. No better typified than looking at history. And Jack Welch, CEO for General Electric during 1981 to 2001. During that 20-year period, Jack Welch grew General Electric from a $14 billion company to a $410 billion company. He didn't do that through organic growth. He did that through acquisitions. Over 600 acquisitions during his tenure with GE. In 1999, Fortune magazine named Jack Welch the manager of the century. He was known as coining a phrase once where he said, "It's faster, cheaper, and easier to buy a business than to build one from scratch." So let's continue with our underlying drivers in the M&A market. We know that companies are continuing the need to grow. We know it's a lot about cash available, but there's another element that's driving M&A markets and have done so even more over the last several years. And those are called private equity funds or private equity groups. I always ask my clients if they understand what private equity means and how private equity funds operate. And about 50% will say, yeah, I've got a fair understanding of that. But about 50% of that 50% really do understand what private equity is about. So I'd like to take just a brief moment and share with you Investopedia's definition of private equity so that everybody's on the same page. A private equity is an alternative investment class and consists of capital that is not listed on a public exchange. Private equity is composed of funds and investors that directly invest in private companies or that engage in buyouts of public companies, typically resulting in a delisting of the public equity. Private equity investors come primarily from institutional investors and accredited investors who can dedicate substantial sums of money for extended periods of time. Keep that in mind for a moment. They invest this money for an extended period of time into these private equity funds. Now, let me come back to accredited investor. An accredited investor is a person that must have an annual income exceeding $200,000 per year or $300,000 as a joint family income. A person is also considered an accredited investor if they have a net worth exceeding $1 million, either individually or jointly with a spouse. Private equity offers several advantages to companies and startups. It's favored by companies because it allows them access to liquidity as an alternative to conventional financial mechanisms, such as high interest bank loans or listing on public markets. And certain forms of private equity, such as venture capital, also finance ideas in early stage companies. So let's explore a little bit about how private equity is driving the M&A market. Who are these private equity groups and what do they do? Well, their mission is very simple. It's to buy businesses, grow them, and then sell them, with rare exception. There are a small percentage of private equity funds that are what are called long-term funds. In other words, they buy and hold. They buy a business to integrate it into another business for long-term strategy. Most private equity fund managers buy businesses to fix them, clean them up, grow them, and sell them in a 3 to 5 year period. Their fundraising over the last several years has been absolutely unprecedented. If we look over the last 15 years, last year, this is a report as of November, through November of last year, new private equity fund raising efforts had reached just shy of $300 billion. By the end of the year, they surpassed $300 billion in new money for the first time in history. Now, if we were to look at what's called dry powder, which is the accumulation of funds over years that has not yet been spent, that number is over $2 trillion. Most private equity transactions include some form of leverage. So if you include leverage to that buying power, you're talking about somewhere in the neighborhood of maybe $3 to $4 trillion of buying power. Remember, this is part of the demand equation in our supply-demand curve for the M&A industry. So why is there so much interest in private equity? It's the natural inclination for investors. They chase returns. They want to maximize their returns. So let's take a quick look at some return or some investing vehicles. From private equity to venture capital to real assets to the secondary markets, which are owners of shares selling shares, not the original issuers selling shares. F of F is funds of funds, all these different investment vehicles. But the one at the top is private equity. A better return than any other public investment vehicle. That's why their fundraising efforts are at record highs. What else about private equity groups? It's creating a situation where there's more money chasing fewer and fewer quality deals. Once again, demand far exceeding supply. When we apply these laws of supply and demand, we realize why prices are where they are in the marketplace today. Now, an interesting fact about these private equity funds that are important for you to recognize, which is also part of the equation of what's driving prices. When they establish a fund, there's a time frame in which that money must be spent. If they don't spend it within that time frame, they have to give it back. Now, they're always out raising new funds because the fund managers themselves are typically from the professional era, maybe they're ex-CEOs, senior executives. They're not typically the investors. So these fund managers are always out raising another fund because remember, every fund has a time frame. So when they're out raising a fund, one of the first questions that any investor might ask is, how was the performance of your previous fund? Well, if all of a sudden they have to say from their previous fund, they had to give some of the money back because the fund reached a deadline in which they were required to either invest that money or give it back to their investors. Now, their investors may have had that money tied up for as long as 5 years or more, getting a paltry money market return because the money has got to be readily available. So now the way they have to answer that question is, yeah, we had to give some of our money back. So the investor says, well, so you kept your investors' money in that previous fund for 5 years, giving them a paltry money market return, and then you turn around and gave them their money back. Thank you very much. Good luck on your next fund. So the point being, when private equity gets near the end of a fund, and some of that dry powder is reaching an age where they've got to spend it, they can become very aggressive in their bidding process. Once again, driving that demand and raising prices. They don't spend it, they've got to give it back. When we talk about entrepreneurs, there are some misnomers in the market that I'd like to clarify. First, when we talk about private equity, there's a history with private equity. And if we go back 10, 15, 20 years, the way they operated is quite different than the way they operate today. And part of that is a result of the new entries into the private equity world, which is with as much money that's out there, private equity fund managers and business managers have had to change the way they operate. But regardless, this base premise is a misnomer. And the premise is, well, I've heard private equity comes in and takes over your business and sells off your assets and sucks out all the excess cash. Well, first of all, how would that make sense? Why would they do that? That is contrary to their primary motivation, which is to grow the business and sell it. You'll find with any investor, a big company, private investor, a private equity group, they typically don't like to put a lot of money or invest in hard assets, buildings, equipment. And the reason for that is the return on those assets are far less than I expect to get as a return on the business itself. Now, if I'm investing in a building, obviously there's appreciation in the building, but will it be at the rate at which I could achieve in the business? Probably not. Equipment, do I want to put a lot of money into a depreciating asset like equipment? Now, sometimes in a bidding process, a buyer is forced to acquire those assets. So after acquisition, they may sell off some of those assets because I don't have to own the assets as long as I can control them with a long-term lease. I would much rather take that money and put it into people, advertising, technology. So to think that a buyer wants to come in and literally strip down your business, that's a misnomer. Okay, so eliminate that thought process. One. Two is, and this is probably even a more serious misnomer, and it typically takes place in times when the markets are heating up or nearing the peak. And a buyer or a client says, and I hear this continually, but I've got so much growth potential. Man, if I keep growing my business, if I could double the size of my business, it's naturally going to be worth more, right? And not necessarily true. Let's take a look. If you have the opportunity to double your business over the next few years, once again, the outset, when I talked about the markets, I talked about revenues and profits. You can't ignore them, but it's not the sole driver behind value. Now, I did talk about the value premise, where buyers look at cash flow, they determine risk, and they have a base value premise on what they're willing to pay for this revenue-producing asset, in this case, a business. Now, that's before consideration of what's going on in the market. How many other buyers are out there? What's the bidding look like? Am I competing against 3, 4, 5, 10 other buyers? Or am I the lone interested party? Depending upon where we are in that supply-demand curve of buyers and sellers. Because that's what dictates ultimately the price that will be paid for a business. Let's take a look at prices over time. In a strong M&A market, multiples tend to reach double digits. This is as of late 2019, multiples had reached a point of 10.4, and that's 10.4 times historic earnings. Now let me explain multiples here for just a brief moment. A multiple is not the baseline methodology for determining value. Remember, we talked about value being a result of what I can generate as cash flow, my ROI expectation, and now I have a mathematical formula called the capital asset pricing model that allows me to determine what's referred to as the present value of this investment, right? So once I have that value, I can now easily look at historical earnings, what's called EBITDA, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. I can look at that relationship and I can calculate a multiple. What that multiple now allows me to do is measure the value of businesses amongst themselves within an industry, compare it to businesses in other industries, or, as we're doing here, comparing it over time. In our industry, we look at what multiples are over time. And you can see in 2009, multiples were running around 7.7. This is on average all businesses, okay? And this data is from a source called PitchBook, to the peak of the market, near the peak of the market at a 10.4. However, what happens in the market when it reverts back to those lower multiples? Because remember, we're talking about these cycles. They go up, they go down, they go up, they go down. Both activity and prices. So let's take a look at a scenario where prices could revert back to this lower period of time. Let's take a hypothetical. Your business is doing $1 million of earnings, EBITDA, which puts you at a value based upon the average multiple at end of 2019 at 10.4. So you have a $10.4 million baseline value. Now, again, this is before the competition amongst buyers. Several times, or this is actually, that's the result of competition with buyers. At several years of time, you grow the business. Now, maybe you're not going to double the business, but maybe you're able to grow it by 50%. So you're now doing $1.5 million of earnings, but multiples have reverted back to the average of 2009, of 7.7. So now you're worth 11.5 million. That's a whopping 11% more, having grown your business by 50% due to a change in the market. A longer-term average of multiples can tend to be closer to the 4 and 5 range. What if we hit a trough and multiples reverted back to 5? Your $1.5 million business is now worth $7.5 million. It's a 28% reduction, and you're 50% bigger. So don't get too hung up on the fact that there's tremendous growth opportunity in your business. Because when do you think the best time would be to sell a business? When you've peaked on your growth potential, or when you got a lot of growth left? Okay. You can be paid for that growth now without the work, the risk, the time, the energy to achieve that growth. Okay. So what can happen in the markets? Let's talk about these interrupters for just a minute. Geopolitical events, tariffs in China, Russia is Russia, conflicts in Iran. These interrupters raise the level of risk in the market. Risk raises ROI, ROI lowers value. How about our own politics? There's an election coming up. What if there's a change in administration? What's their viewpoint on private equity, capital gains, legislative changes that could all of a sudden render your business worth less, or the amount that you take home significantly less if a new administration would attack capital gains tax? Unforeseen tragic events, an outbreak of war. 9/11 is a perfect example. It wasn't necessarily war, it was war, but it wasn't declared a war. But after 9/11, deals didn't just slow down, they stopped. There was almost zero activity for a reasonable period of time after 9/11 because the risk or the fear of additional attacks. Deals that did close, $20 million deals became $3, $5 million deals overnight. In most cases, deals were just canceled. If they hadn't closed on the day of 9/11, the industry nearly went dark. And what are we experiencing today? Now, these are often considered to be shorter term interrupters, but we're in the middle of one now. Had a major impact on the economy. Lower middle market M&A has not been affected quite so much because it's not public markets that have been affected. It's large companies with cash, it's private equity that has to spend their cash, that are repositioning their businesses for the expected rebound, which is occurring now as our economies begin to open back up. So what do? How can you be ready for the market? Well, first of all, it's important that you understand what a buyer wants, how they buy, what drives value for them, how they determine value, and how does your business and the characteristics of your company match up with what a buyer wants, what they like, what they must have. If you can find a buyer that absolutely needs what you have as an extension to their product line, as an adjunct service to their offering. We sometimes run into buyers who tell us that their clients are clamoring, their customers are clamoring for this product. They may have attempted to produce, manufacture, or find that product, and they failed in their efforts to do so. And you happen to be in that market with that product. Now, you're fortunate if you understand that, but oftentimes a buyer will not let you know why you're so attracted to them, but you got to figure that out. Don't try to do that on your own. By having an advisor, you're able to focus on your business. To do this process and do it right, may take 9 to 12 months to sell a business. That's a period of time when you should be focused more intently on your business, possibly than ever before in your history. Stick to your knitting, as we say. Okay? I want to thank you for your time today. I hope we have some future webinars where we'll talk about things like value, how buyers determine value, how important value is to you, and how you can maximize that value. Now, as we mentioned in the upper right-hand corner, there was an area for some questions. If you have any questions, Sydney, who has been working with me in this webinar, will be giving me those questions here in just a moment, and I'll try to answer as many of them as I can. If you happen to have a question that you'd like to address with me personally, you can see my email right here, Karnofel, that's Karnofel at Benchmark, INTL, that's Benchmark International, abbreviated INTL.com. Send me a direct question and I will personally answer that for you. Let me see here what Sydney has provided for me. First question, does the economy typically go back and forth between a buyer's market and a seller's market? Well, as you could see from the historical markets, yes, they do. These markets have repeated the cycles over and over and over in a much tighter time frame over the last 50 years. But if you look at that one particular slide, we could go back 100 years and these cycles continue to repeat themselves. Some are a bit more shallow, some are a bit more steep, but an 8 to 10 average, peak to peak, is typically what we see. What would make a private equity group buy and hold a business instead of sell the business? Every private equity fund that's established, at the outset of the fund, they put together what's referred to as a prospectus, more used and referred to in the public markets than the private markets, but it's the same document. It's an outline of what the expectations are for the private equity fund managers to use the funds for. It typically outlines the size of transactions that they will achieve to target, the industries in which they will target, and the time frame for their entry and exit into those markets. So the time frame is the fixed amount of time that the money must be held. Now, some funds identify at the outset that it's an unlimited time frame. So that fund will not have a stop date. So those are buy and hold funds. Far less common than a classic private equity fund that's a buy and sell, because they typically make their money on the exit. The long-term holders are making their money off the generation of profits over time with the buy, hold, and the integration of companies, okay? So is it best to sell at the peak of the market? Don't try to hit the peak of the market. A lot of times owners sell because of personal reasons. Things happen in their lives. Sometimes it's family related, sometimes it's health related. You'd be surprised to realize that a large portion of owners sell their businesses because they're bored, they're burnt out. When that time comes, it's almost irrelevant what the market is. You got to get out, because when you reach that point, you lose that passion to continue to drive and run the business. That's kind of the beginning of the end. So don't try to hit the peak. If you have a length of a window that you can look at, then try to pick a time when you know that the markets are strong, where there's a lot of buyer activity, when you know there's that imbalance between buyers and sellers, but more importantly, when you can illustrate that there's growth opportunity in your business. That's the best time to sell, okay? When do you think this market will end? Boy, I wish I had that crystal ball, but I don't. All we can look at is history. In an 11-year market cycle, is there a lot of breadth left in this market? I don't know. Markets tend to run in patterns, and those patterns are often developed through what's known as that horde mentality, right? Everybody kind of jumps on the bandwagon and it hits the peak. When it hits the peak, everybody's on the bandwagon, and then people begin to realize, oh, it's too late, and we go back down the other side. Well, then you got the Fed interacting with attempting to soften the market, but then you've got interrupters like our government. That obviously, the current administration doesn't want this market to end, but eventually it will reach a point where it has to end and it has to soften. Because in strong markets, inefficiencies kind of creep in because we're overzealous, we overbuild, we overproduce. So is it likely that this market will end in 2021? Yeah, it's pretty likely. Is it determined? No. Part of it depends upon what happens in the balance of the year, what happens with the coronavirus, what happens with the election. So nobody really knows. I wish I could predict that date, but I just can't. So if I miss the market, is it impossible to sell? Good question. And the answer is, again, no. Part of the premise of maximizing value is utilizing a process where you identify the right type of buyers that have the right potential fit to take advantage of what you've got, or what we refer to oftentimes as the outlier, which is that company that is looking at your type of business, your industry, as an adjunct to what they do. Maybe they've maxed the ability to grow in their particular markets. Maybe they're saturated, and maybe there's a complementary product or service out there that's not directly tied to what they do, but indirectly that they feel has significant growth opportunity. That could be your company. So identifying a wide variety of businesses and then creating what's commonly referred to as an auction process. It's very difficult, if not impossible, to negotiate with one buyer. It's often said, if you're dealing with one buyer, you're not negotiating, you're begging, okay? So the key, regardless of the time in the market in which you decide to sell, the key is to surround yourself with multiple buyers, potentially, who are simultaneously bidding on your business. What do you think the market will look like in 2021? Well, again, I wish I could tell you. A lot of that depends upon what happens in the election, because that could have a very strong bearing on the future of the industry. The new administration, Democrats have a different view of taxes. They have a different view of private equity. They have a different view of capital gains. So any or all of those changes due to a new administration in the latter part or the mid part of 2021 could have a dramatic impact on the buyer side of our M&A markets, and therefore reduce demand. And of course, if the economy softens, then of course you've got supply that's increasing, and now you've got this taking place. And what's going to naturally happen to prices? They're going to come down. They're going to come down as the same that happens in all markets. So I think that's covered a couple of the other questions. It looks like we've got some repeat questions that Sydney has provided me. So I want to thank you all again for your participation today. I look forward to the possibility of some additional webinars in the future. And I want to wish you all the very best of luck. Again, if you have any questions, please address them to either me directly, or Sydney also has a link where you can address some additional questions to our corporate staff, and we'll be happy to get those answers back to you. Best of luck to all, and stay safe.